The biting wind whips between the tombstones, carrying murmurs that no one should hear. You feel a shiver crawl up your spine, but it's not cold, not really. A step behind you, then another. Your heart races. You know you came alone. So, who is there? Press play, but know that some stories once heard never leave you in peace. The vigil of the forgotten. The fine rain drummed on the roof of the small concrete shack, illuminated only by the cold light of a fluorescent lamp about to burn out. Murillo, a 23-year-old, adjusted his worn coat and took a long sip of the lukewarm coffee he had taken from the thermos. His first shift as a night watchman at São Bartolomeu Cemetery had barely started, and he already felt the oppressive weight of the place. The old boss, Seu Lázaro, had wished him good luck with a strange smile before leaving, but not before dropping an enigmatic warning. Don't forget to do the count, always. Murillo didn't quite understand what that meant, but he didn't pay much attention. The job was simple: patrol the cemetery, ensure no vandals invaded the site, and record anything out of the ordinary. As far as he knew, cemeteries were just that. Quiet and forgotten places, full of sad stories and names engraved in marble. At midnight, the cold wind cut like blades. Murillo lit a cigarette and began his first round. The lined-up tombstones looked like shadows sculpted in the darkness. He followed the main path, sweeping the area with the flashlight, when something caught his attention. A tombstone seemed displaced. He approached, frowning. The name carved on the stone was worn by time, but it was possible to read part of the inscription. Here lies. The rest was illegible, but there was something strange there. That tombstone wasn't on the list he had checked earlier. Feeling a shiver run down his spine, he continued his round. A few minutes later, another disturbing detail: a wooden cross fallen on the churned earth, as if someone had messed with it recently. He wrote down the occurrences in the notebook and decided to move on. Maybe they were just old things that no one cared for anymore. But as he passed through a corridor between the graves, he smelled a strange odor. A damp and old smell, something between wet earth and rotten flesh. Then he heard it, a low whisper, like the wind dragging dry leaves. Only there was no wind now. The sound was coming from behind him. Slowly, Murillo turned around, his eyes wide, fixed in the twilight. There was no one there, just the immobile tombstones, the leaning crosses, and a slight rustling, as if something were moving just beyond his vision. With his heart racing, he decided to go back to the shack. Maybe sleep was playing tricks on his mind. But when reviewing the register notebook, something made his stomach churn. He had noted 84 tombs at his initial count, but now, counting the new occurrences, there were 85. One more tomb. And then, a sharp sound echoed in the night. A weak, dragged-out laugh coming from somewhere in the cemetery. A laugh that shouldn't be there. Murillo felt the hairs on his neck stand on end. His fingers trembled as he held the flashlight more firmly. He needed to check. Hurriedly, he left the shack and followed back along the dark path between the tombs towards the sound. Turning one of the main corridors of the cemetery, he saw something that made him stop suddenly. A thin, stooped figure was kneeling in front of one of the tombstones. The skin was pale, almost translucent under the cold moonlight, and the thin fingers scratched the earth as if trying to dig something up. Murillo felt a chilling cold in his spine. "Hey!" His voice came out trembling. The figure stopped, but did not turn around. The watchman took a hesitant step forward, and then the creature rose. Slowly, it turned to him. Murillo stifled a scream. There was no face. The skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been was smooth, like a deformed wax mask. But worst of all was when he noticed something engraved on the tombstone. The creature was digging. It was his name. His body froze. His own tombstone. His own date of death. Today. An icy wind swept through the cemetery, and the faceless thing raised its arms. Murillo tried to run, but his legs didn't obey. An unbearable weariness overcame him. He felt his eyes heavy, his eyelids closing against his will. The laughter echoed once more, now inside his head. The next morning, So Lazaro arrived to take over the shift and found the shack empty. No sign of Murillo, just the register notebook on the table with a different count. 83 tombs instead of 84. The tombstone that Murillo had seen the night before was now completely empty, without name, without date. Just a new open grave in front of it, waiting for the next watchman. Tomb number 77. The full moon hung high in the sky when the four friends crossed the rusty gate of the Santa Helena Municipal Cemetery. The icy wind whistled through the dry trees, and the sound of their footsteps on the damp earth seemed to echo between the tombstones. The challenge was simple: spend the whole night there, without running away, and prove that the stories about the place were just urban legends. Carlos, the most skeptical of the group, laughed as he illuminated the path with the flashlight. "Do you really believe this nonsense? It's just a pile of old stones." Anna, on the other hand, wasn't so sure. "My grandfather always said this cemetery is different, that there are tombs that appear and disappear." Marcos, trying to maintain courage, joked, "Maybe we'll find a friendly ghost who tells us a story." They followed the pebble path to the heart of the cemetery, where the oldest tombs were located. Vegetation grew between the tombstones, and some were leaning, as if something underground was trying to push them out. It was then that Gustavo, the quietest of the group, stopped suddenly. "Look at that," he murmured, pointing to a tombstone at the end of the corridor of tombs. Approaching, they noticed it was different from the others. There was no name engraved, only the number 77 carved into the stone, and the earth in front of it seemed recently disturbed. Anna felt a shiver run down her spine. "That wasn't on the cemetery map. I saw it before we came. That tomb doesn't exist." The air seemed to thicken. Carlos, unfazed, touched the cold stone and laughed. "Maybe it's a new hole for some poor soul. Nothing more." But then a low noise came from the earth. A muffled sound, something like a scratching coming from beneath them. The four looked at each other, paralyzed, and then the earth in front of Tomb 77 began to move. Anna's breathing became heavy. "Did you hear that?" Marcos held the flashlight firmly. "That can only be an animal, right?" The ground stirred again, as if something was trying to emerge. Pale, twisted fingers broke through the earth. Gustavo recoiled with a stifled cry as a skeletal hand pulled itself out. In a few seconds, a cadaverous figure wrapped in rags soaked with mud came out of the hole, gasping as if it had just escaped from hell itself. Deep-set eyes gleamed in the darkness, and its mouth opened, releasing a hoarse whisper. "The next." Carlos, finally overcome by terror, darted away, followed by Anna and Marcos. Gustavo, however, remained paralyzed, staring at the thing rising from the tomb. The creature took a step forward, and the young man fell backward, scratching the ground to move away. The being pointed at him with bony fingers. "The next is you!" Gustavo let out a piercing scream and finally managed to stand up, darting away. The four ran desperately through the cemetery, tripping over tombstones and ignoring the screams that seemed to echo through the wind. When they crossed the gate and left the property, the creature stopped at the entrance, staring at them. And then it disappeared. The friends kept running until they reached the main street, where they finally stopped, trying to catch their breath. None of them spoke. None of them could believe what had happened. In the following days, Gustavo began to change. He didn't talk about that night, but his eyes were always deep-set, his skin increasingly pale. He complained of horrible nightmares, of voices calling him. The next. The following week, Gustavo disappeared. When the three friends returned to the cemetery to look for him, they found a new tomb next to number 77. Gustavo's tomb. No name, no dates, just the number 78 engraved on the stone. The Cemetery of the Faceless. The city of Nova Esperanza had many stories, but none was as feared as that of the old cemetery on top of the hill. People whispered that those who entered after midnight came out different, not dead, but forgotten, as if something inside that place erased their identities. Laura was an investigative journalist who didn't believe in those legends. Determined to prove that everything was just mass hysteria, she decided to enter the cemetery alone, carrying only a flashlight and a recorder. Her intention was to spend a few hours on the site, collect images, and write an article demystifying the story. She crossed the rusty gates shortly before midnight. The wind blew icy, and absolute silence weighed on the environment. The cemetery was vast, with tombstones worn by time and graves covered in weeds. Laura turned on the recorder and began documenting her experience. "Nothing unusual so far," she said, her voice echoing through the empty space. But then she noticed something strange. The tombstones had no names, just smooth surfaces of cold stone, as if they had never been engraved. Laura frowned and walked further inside. All the graves were like that. This doesn't make sense," she murmured, touching one of the tombstones. A shiver ran up her spine when she felt the stone pulse under her fingers, as if it were alive. A whisper ran through the air, low and drawn out. She spun the flashlight around, but there was no one. Fear crept into her, but Laura was stubborn. She continued walking until she noticed a figure in the distance. A man was standing with his back to her, between the tombs. He wore old-fashioned clothes and seemed lost. "Sir, are you okay?" The figure did not respond. Laura approached cautiously, and when she finally saw his face, her breath failed. He had no face. Where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. Laura stumbled back, stifling a scream, but then she realized something even worse. Other figures emerged around her, all faceless, and all whispering her name. Terror overcame Laura. She turned and ran through the cemetery, but the paths seemed to change, stretching in impossible directions. The gate was too far away, more than it should be. Then she felt a cold hand grab her arm. Laura screamed and tried to break free, but the strength was relentless. The whispers intensified, and a voice stood out among them. "You have forgotten who you are. Now you belong to us." Laura's consciousness slipped away like sand between her fingers. Her name, her story, her memories, everything dissolved into a dark and endless void. The next morning, the city's residents found her recorder fallen at the entrance to the cemetery. No one knew who had left it there, and among the nameless tombstones, a new, faceless figure joined the forgotten, wrong grave. The rain fell finally on the Peace Valley Cemetery when Samuel said his final goodbye to his wife, Marina. The coffin descended slowly, and he felt a pang in his chest. After years of marriage, the idea of returning home without her was unbearable. The gravediggers threw the first shovelful of dirt, and he walked away, leaving the site under the compassionate gaze of the priest and some relatives. His best friend, Renato, held his shoulder. "If you need anything, I'm here." Samuel just nodded and left the cemetery, feeling empty. The next morning, something was wrong. When he returned to visit Marina's grave, Samuel froze. The space where she had been buried was empty. There was no cross, no flowers, just churned earth. Panic took over him. "Where is she?" he shouted to the cemetery caretaker. The man, confused, took him to the administrator. They checked the records and there it was. Marina had been buried in plot 42, but Samuel remembered clearly. The tomb was 43. "It can't be," he murmured. With a pang in his chest, he insisted that they dig up grave 43. The administrator, reluctant, eventually gave in. A few minutes later, the gravediggers removed the earth, exposing an old, dark wooden coffin. "That's not hers," Samuel whispered. Before they could decide what to do, something happened. The coffin moved. Slowly, the lid creaked, as if something inside was trying to get out. The gravediggers recoiled, the administrator paled, and then, with a dry crack, the lid slid to the side. Inside, a cadaverous figure opened its eyes and smiled. Samuel stumbled backward, horrified. The bones were covered by remnants of rotten flesh, and sunken eyes stared at him with a hungry intelligence. The thing raised a hand and pointed to him with a slow, calculated gesture. "You dug up the wrong one." The voice was a whisper. but it echoed in his mind like thunder. Samuel screamed and ran away, while the gravediggers covered the hole as quickly as possible. But something was different. When he looked at the tombstones around, they all had the same name. His name. His heart raced, and he turned to call Renato, the administrator, anyone, but no one was there. The entire cemetery seemed empty, too silent. And then, he realized, he never left the cemetery that night. From the moment he opened that coffin, he belonged to that place, and his grave awaited him, the last burial. The São Miguel Cemetery was about to be closed forever. After more than a century of burials, the authorities decided that there would be no more room for new corpses. In a few days, the gates would be locked and the tombstones forgotten by time. Jose, the gravedigger, was one of the few who still worked there. For 30 years he dug graves, buried strangers, and cared for the tombstones. But that night, as he made his last round, he noticed something strange. One more tomb. He was sure that all the tombs were accounted for, but that one was new. The earth was fresh, recently disturbed. However, no burial had been done in the last few days. Who had dug that grave? Curious and suspicious, Jose approached. The name on the tombstone made him freeze. Jose Antonio da Silva. It was his name. His date of birth was correct. The date of death, today. His body went rigid. His heart raced. Some practical joke. An absurd mistake. He recoiled, but then heard something coming from under the earth. A muffled sound. A scratch. Something inside the coffin was moving. Fear took over Jose, but his logical mind tried to find an explanation. Maybe a wrong burial. Maybe someone had been buried alive. He ran to get his shovel and started digging frantically. With each shovelful of earth removed, the sounds got louder. Desperate knocks came from inside the coffin. When he finally reached the wooden lid, he hesitated. His hands trembled. He opened it, and inside was himself. Jose himself, pale and gasping, stared at him from inside the coffin, his eyes wide with terror. "Run!" the buried version of him shouted. Before he could react, something behind him moved. He turned around and saw shadows rise from the tombstones. Skeletal figures with distorted faces crawled towards him. Bony hands reached out to him, and whispers echoed through the wind. The last burial needs to happen. Jose tried to run, but the dead grabbed him. He screamed, struggling, but his body was pulled into the grave, into the coffin. The lid slammed shut, and the earth began to cover him quickly, as if the cemetery itself was sealing his fate. The next morning, the caretaker found the cemetery in perfect condition. No sign of turmoil, no newly dug grave, just a new tombstone, where there had been nothing before. Jose Antonio da Silva, rest in peace, the Lady of the Black Veil. In the small town of São Vicente, there was a legend that everyone knew but few dared to mention. They said that every night, shortly after midnight, a woman dressed in black wandered through the central cemetery, crying over a nameless tomb. Those who tried to approach were never seen again. Nicholas, a young skeptical detective, was hired by a desperate family. Their son, Leandro, a curious teenager, had disappeared 3 nights before. His last trace led to the cemetery. Determined to solve the mystery, Nicholas decided to investigate the legend on his own. That night, shortly before midnight, he crossed the rusty gates and entered the cemetery. The cold wind blew between the old tombstones, and an oppressive silence dominated the place. He held a flashlight firmly in one hand and a revolver in the other, just in case. He walked between the graves, observing every detail. That's when he saw her, a woman in a long black dress, standing in front of a worn tombstone. Her veil completely covered her face, and low sobs escaped her throat. Nicholas approached cautiously. "Madam, are you okay?" She stopped crying. A heavy silence ensued. Then, slowly, she turned her head in his direction. Even under the veil, Nicholas felt that something was very wrong. His heart raced, and a primitive instinct told him to run, but he forced himself to stay. "I'm looking for a missing boy," he said, his voice more trembling than he would have liked. "Have you seen anything?" The woman tilted her head slightly, as if studying the detective. Then she pointed to the tomb in front of her. The tombstone had no name, just a phrase engraved on the stone. They take those who seek too much. Nicholas felt a shiver run up his spine. He took a step back. What does that mean? The woman made a low sound, something between a laugh and a sob. Then she raised a pale hand and pulled back the veil. The detective held his breath. She had no face, just smooth, stretched skin where the eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The flashlight in his hand flickered. Nicholas tried to take a step back, but his feet seemed stuck to the ground. The lady of the black veil stretched out her arms. The darkness around seemed to move. Whispers filled the air. Nicholas heard voices, voices of people calling his name, voices that seemed to come from afar, from inside the earth. Then cold hands grabbed his wrists. He screamed and tried to break free, but the entire cemetery seemed to come alive. Shadows emerged from the tombstones. Pale figures with absent faces crawled towards him. Before he could react, he was pulled to the ground. His last thought was a flash of understanding. He had sought too much. The next morning, residents found his flashlight fallen among the tombs. There was no sign of him. The nameless tombstone was still there, but now a new phrase was engraved below the first. They take those who ask too much.